This is London Tonight with Ben Scotchbrook.
Good evening to you. They've been sentenced. For his part in Stephen Lawrence's murder, David Norris has been jailed for at least 14 years. Gary Dobson for no less than 15. Anticipating calls for longer sentences, the Old Bailey judge said he had no choice but to apply the laws in force when they committed their crime. But outside the court, Stephen's father said the sentencing was only one step in a long, long journey, and that in a year's time, he hopes the other killers will also be in prison. Ronke Phillips reports.
Looking relieved but emotional, Doreen Lawrence emerged from the Old Bailey to be greeted by a huge crowd, cheering and shouting justice. She told them today she could press the play button on her life for the first time in 18 years.
It's the beginning, I think, of starting a new life, because we've been in limbo for so long. So today is where we can look to start moving on and just, I don't know, try and take control of my life once more.
Thank you. I think we'll go. Thank you very much.
The record crowds who'd gathered outside the court were just as jubilant when Neville Lawrence appeared.
This is only one step in a long, long journey. I said yesterday I didn't know where I was going to go from here. One of my greatest hopes is that these people have now realized that they've been found out. And is now going to go and lay down in their bed and think that they weren't the only ones who were responsible for the death of my son.
Earlier, Stephen's parents had been inside the packed courtroom to see their son's murderers sentenced. Gary Dobson was jailed for a minimum of 15 years and 2 months, and David Norris for at least 14 years and 3 months. They were treated as juveniles because they were under 18 when the killing took place. But Dobson received a longer sentence because he's currently serving a 5-year jail term for dealing drugs. Stony-faced, Dobson didn't look back as he was led to the cells. But Norris blew a kiss and gave a thumbs up to family and friends in the public gallery. His father shouted out, "Shame on all of you." Stephen was stabbed by a gang of white youths who charged at him yelling racist abuse as he waited at a bus stop in Eltham in 1993. During the trial, the jury was shown an undercover police video in which the gang indulged in racist rants. Before he sentenced them, the judge, Mr. Justice Tracy, called the murder a racist crime driven by hatred. The judge then took the unusual step of issuing his own appeal for witnesses to Stephen's murder to come forward. He said there are still 3 or 4 killers out there and they too should be brought to justice. The same sentiment was repeated by the police.
Is that the other people involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence should not rest easily in their beds. We are still investigating this case.
In 1993, the Lawrences resented speaking to the police. Today, the two sides have vowed to work together to bring an end to a journey which has lasted 18 long years. Ronke Phillips, London Tonight, the Old Bailey.
As we've heard, Mr. Justice Tracy began his sentencing today by admitting the terms could be lower than some might expect. He had no choice, he said, but to apply the law as it stood back in 1993, when the killers were just teenagers. Gary Dobson is now 36 years old and David Norris 35. But when they murdered Stephen Lawrence, they were 17 and 16, and as such, they were sentenced today as juveniles. The current law means adults convicted of racially aggravated knife murder face a minimum jail sentence of 25 years. But under the law at the time of Stephen's murder, which the judge had to apply, juveniles received shorter sentences for such crimes, a minimum of 12 years. Also in 1993, the Home Secretary was responsible for determining the minimum term, but the law was changed in 2000 after a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights on the case of Jamie Bolger's murderers. Now it is the trial judge who sets the minimum term for juvenile murderers. I'm joined now by Ross Dixon, who is a criminal defence solicitor. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Is it always the case that anyone convicted of a crime, whatever the crime, is sentenced according to the circumstances and the law when the crime was committed?
It absolutely is, and the judge made it very plain today in his sentencing remarks that he really had to follow the law as it was at the time the offence was committed. I mean, what's interesting, I think, since that time is, again, I think has been made clear by the judge in those remarks, is that if the offence had been committed today and had been committed by adults, the sentence he would be imposing would be very much greater than the sentence he would have imposed back then for adults committing the same offence. So there's been a very large increase in sentencing for these types of offences in the intervening period.
But his hands, as we say, were bound by the law back in 1993.
They were.
But that seems to throw up a bit of a clash, really, because on the one hand, he has to stick by the 1993 rules,
yes.
But back in 1993, it was the Home Secretary who could set the final tariff, but we're now told that that's not the case because the law has changed in 2000, so it doesn't seem to ring true.
It's an anomaly, I think, and it's an anomaly because of the extraordinary length of time it's taken for these two men to stand trial and to be convicted. One would hope it's an anomaly that's not going to be repeated on very many occasions in the future. I think there's one important point that's worth making, though, about the sentence that the two men have received. They've both been given life sentences. The thing that we're talking about at the moment is the minimum tariff, the minimum period of imprisonment that those two men will now have to serve. I can tell you, based on my experience, that it is extraordinarily unlikely that that is the only period of time they will serve. Once they reach the end of that tariff period, the minimum sentence, they will have to apply to the parole board to be released. They will have to satisfy the parole board that they are no longer a risk to members of the public. And again, in my experience, that is an application that is difficult and will take a long time before they can satisfy the parole board of that.
All right, Ross Dixon, thank you so much for explaining all that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, if you're watching last night's programme, you'll have seen that Stephen Lawrence's friend, Dwayne Brooks, saying that he felt Eltham in 1993 was dangerous for black people, let alone young black boys by themselves. So what made it so unsafe and, in Stephen's case, lethal? Piers Hopkirk has been speaking to families who have harsh memories of that time, living with hatred and violence, and how a wave of race attacks sparked violent protests.
I'd have to literally fight my way through gangs of skinheads just to get home.
Even older people would attack us. You know, there were cases of people being spat on in the streets.
They'd taunt you and, you know, sometimes it ended up in fights.
For many in ethnic minorities, some parts of southeast London felt too dangerous to enter. Eltham was one. The BNP had its base in nearby Welling, soon becoming the focus of demonstrations by anti-fascist groups. In the 4 years that followed the BNP's arrival here, there were a spate of race hate attacks in the area. One of the victims, Roland Adams, killed in a crime that mirrored the murder of Stephen Lawrence, but some 2 years before.
A lengthy list of racially motivated crimes that went unheeded. They weren't prosecuted for it in the way that they should have been prosecuted, and that festered in my mind, and that created this carnage that ensued afterwards.
Dr. William Henry is an expert on race, a social anthropologist and a youth worker.
We need to put these things in perspective and not act like in 1993 just sprung out of a vacuum. There was a history there. If you think about 1993, areas like this, you know, there was not a high percentage of BME people. So therefore, it was easy for groups like the National Front or other far-right groups to create their strongholds here. Because if you put it in its context, you know, when African Caribbean people migrated here, they didn't really come to this part of London.
The Eltham that Stephen Lawrence stepped out into in April 1993 was for some a place of fear, intimidation and even violence. But now, nearly a generation on, just how much has changed here?
Eltham has moved on like all communities in terms of race relations, and we'll continue to do that. We will all have to stay vigilant on the issue of racism, because those racists will always be there, and the decent majority, as I've said before, has got to take those people on and make sure that they don't hold sway.
I think it goes in generations. I think the older generation are stuck in their ways and in their beliefs. I think the younger generation stand more of a chance as long as we teach them right from wrong.
I don't think it was as bad. It is as bad as it was then. I think the community, people's eyes, the generation now, their eyes have opened up.
But have tensions gone or merely been buried under the surface? During the recent riots, intimidation showed its face again as groups of mainly white men took to the streets, they claimed, to defend them.
Things have absolutely changed since, you know, the tragic death of Stephen Lawrence. But saying that, we cannot act like our race relations have been resolved. You cannot expect to cure something that has got, you know, a few hundred years of history. We've got to remain on our guard and we've got to remain ever vigilant. Otherwise, you know, who knows what will happen to the generations who are coming behind us.
Dr. William Henry ending that report by Piers Hopkirk. Well, despite the fact the Met has now secured 2 convictions for Stephen's murder, his mother Doreen isn't alone in thinking the force still has much to make up for. Many feel the Met has yet to shake off the damning charge that it is institutionally racist. Mark Duggan was shot dead by armed officers in Tottenham last August. And while the Independent Police Complaints Commission investigates the circumstances of his death, his family are clear on one thing. They say they have been treated dreadfully by the police, in part because they're black. Here's Phil Bales.
Carol Duggan's nephew Mark was shot dead by police. The incident was blamed for starting last summer's riots. She's with Mark's nephew Kyron and his family as they campaign for what they regard as fairness and justice.
An officer killed Mark. We really want them to come out and hold their hands up and admit what they've done. But right from the beginning there's been cover-ups, cover-ups, cover-ups. It doesn't make me feel confident at all, and it doesn't make us as a family feel confident in the police or anything to do with the case.
Mark Duggan on the right and little Kyron's father Marlon on the left were very close. Shortly after the shooting in Tottenham Hale, Marlon went to the scene, not knowing his brother's body lay covered by a tent. The family say police treated him badly when he asked about Mark.
They sent them on a wild goose chase, saying that he may be in the hospital because somebody was airlifted to the hospital, but apparently that was the police officer that wasn't injured that got airlifted, and Mark was there left at the scene.
The picture initially portrayed of Mark Duggan was one of a gangster. There were reports he shot at police first, though no forensic evidence was found linking him to a gun found near where he was shot. The family say police have never given them an explanation.
We don't know why the police were following Mark. What had he done for them to be following him? You know, things like that, simple little questions that we have not got any answers to. They're not giving us any answers. So if they were really now to want to help us, they'd be moving forward with the case, not delaying, and that's all we're getting now is delays, delays, delays.
The Duggans admire the Lawrence family but do not believe that Stephen's murder has led to an end to racism in the Metropolitan Police. Carol Duggan believes it is hindering the investigation into the shooting of her nephew.
I think the police are still as racist as they've ever been. And you can't say that every individual officer is racist because that's not true. But the institutionalised racism is still there and it's still at the forefront.
The Duggan family say only immediate answers will help ease their grief. Phil Bales, London Tonight, North London.
We asked the Met to comment on the Duggan family's claims, and a spokesman said the Commissioner has made it clear to all staff that racist and discriminatory behaviour will not be tolerated. We are committed to ensuring that all Londoners receive a professional and fair service. Still to come on London Tonight.
The Right Honourable Gentleman knows very well that we had no choice but to